Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Ray Blanchard, the Associate Director for Global Licensing Corporate Business Development at QIAGEN. So, Ray, let's start off by just talking about your company. What do you do, and how are you making a difference in the scientific community?
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to chat with you today. QIAGEN is a leader in the life sciences, particularly in the area of nucleic acid analysis, that is DNA or RNA analysis. Um, we are an academic spinout that started around 1987 on a new chemistry for easily isolating DNA, which has enabled much of the molecular biology and genetics revolution that we're now benefiting from in terms of genome sequencing, personalized therapies, and also fighting COVID-19. The company has evolved and grown for a sectors that has basic research tools, as well as molecular diagnostics and biohealth analysis tools or digital bioinformatics.
And those are big words you're throwing around. They're scientific terms that we've heard of. Maybe we don't quite understand them thoroughly or as thoroughly as you do. You're talking about the building blocks of life, and you use them to essentially solve problems, right? Is that correct?
That's correct. These are the building blocks of life, and our mission is to enable access to valuable insights from the molecular research and clinical healthcare world. We are one step removed from most of the patients, so many people don't recognize our name, but the people in the laboratories, whether it's a clinical laboratory or the academic laboratories, they usually recognize our name. In fact, when the Nobel laureates in chemistry and medicine are announced, we have a contest to see who can first pick up the photographs from the Nobel laureates that are coming that have them in their laboratory. And in more than 80% of the cases, you'll find the QIAGEN's distinctive blue or red logo box in the background on the shelf being used in their lab.
And we talk about the fact that you're working with DNA, RNA, and proteins and those sorts of things and the building blocks of life, as we said. When you talk about that, you think about what you've done. Can you list some of your main accomplishments?
Sure. In addition to the extraction, which is immensely simplified the extractions, we have been a leader in analyzing the sequences of DNA and RNA. This has started in the evolutionary area of a technique called polymerase chain reaction, and more recently in DNA sequencing on a very high throughput scale, all known as next generation DNA sequencing. This is really what's enabled the genomics revolution to be able to study whole genomes at a time of people, and for people to go in and do direct to consumer testing to find out what their genetics are going to predispose them to, as well as how that might interact with various cancer diseases or metabolic diseases.
So generally speaking, how are you helping patients with your work?
We're helping them diagnose the issues that they're affecting. In the case of infectious disease, we have assays to diagnose COVID-19. Our leading diagnostic assay is in the area of TB testing. This is the QuantiFERON Gold TB assay. It's a unique sort of system compared to the old skin test that many people have had used on them over the last 100 years, where a little bit of the antigen would be injected in the arm, and 3 days later, they've got to come back and have a nurse or doctor read this. In this case, it's a simple blood test. The blood is drawn and incubated, and then being able to read out. It's exquisitely sensitive, and as such, the World Health Organization and the United States Centers for Disease Control have declared this kind of assay to be their preferred assay for public health screening for TB. This is a concern currently because we are experiencing globally a resurgence of TB that started before the COVID-19 pandemic and is increasing in part due to the various antibiotic resistant strains of tuberculosis that are now creating health and public health issues.
And I do want to talk more about tuberculosis, but since you mentioned COVID-19, it has been such a significant thing in our lives for a couple of years now. Can you talk more about your work with COVID-19? This is testing that you're doing, are these innovations that your company is responsible for?
Yes, so it's really several facets of the testing around COVID-19. And as we've been coming back to for the company, we are very COVID relevant in supplying materials for the pandemic testing, but we are not COVID dependent. We have a broad portfolio that extends out from underneath this. When people are experiencing and talking about supply chain issues currently, things that are hitting the automobile industries and other consumer goods, we were one of the first companies in the world to get hit by supply chain issues from the pandemic in the spring of 2020. We are the world's largest supplier of kits to isolate the viral RNA that is used to detect and diagnose SARS-CoV-2 virus. And consequently, this huge jump in demand for that strained out not only our manufacturing resources, but also our suppliers' ability to keep us stocked with resources. So this was really an event that first hit us and then has trickled out down and outwards from that. We responded by building out increased manufacturing capacity, working with our suppliers and expanding our supply chain to bring in the materials, both the chemicals and the plastics that are unique to these particular kits, and expand that production in both Germany and the United States here in Montgomery County.
And you mentioned that you are not COVID dependent, you're COVID relevant. Did it take you a long time to put all those resources together and put all those plans together? Or when the pandemic hit and you saw what was happening, you were able to just get all this together and get a plan together? Can you explain that process? Because it seems like a big undertaking, but you have a lot of resources and this is what you do. So can you explain the process of getting ready and putting all that together?
It is a big undertaking. Part of that goes back to our philosophy and our vision, which is making improvements in life possible. The pandemic created a global disruption of life in our world. And to that end, we set about reprioritizing many of our resources in order to respond to that. So that when we first got hit with supply chain in the area of March of 2020, we were able to start responding dramatically by June, the end of June of that year, and really crank up capacity much higher than it had been at pre-pandemic levels for these kits. Wow, at the same time, developing novel molecular diagnostic assays for the SARS-CoV-2 virus to actually do the diagnostics. So while many people were counting on us for the kits to isolate the virus, there were multiple companies that were able to produce tests to diagnose this, and we were one of many of those. Later on in that year, we were one of the first companies to introduce the reagents necessary to sequence the entire genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus very rapidly so that variant tracking could be initiated so that we would understand and the public health agencies understand the difference between the Delta variant, the Omicron variants that were progressing through different countries in the world.
And is your work with COVID ongoing? Are you continuing to expand, basically, is what I'm asking, and continuing to study COVID-19 as it develops and as these strains continue to come out and we hear about them?
That's a great question, Nick, and because it is one where we're expanding, not only expanding on COVID-19, but what the impact of the pandemic has done about viral infectious disease awareness. One of the best examples I can give you is that we were investing into a new type of nucleic acid analysis platform called a digital PCR system called the QIAGEN before the pandemic started. We launched that instrument in the fall of 2020. This is a very sensitive instrument that can process through samples that start from a very large size. And one of the fortuitous aspects that we realized for this is this kind of instrumentation was ideally suited for wastewater surveillance of SARS-CoV-19. So where people were reading in the newspapers about universities or cities and towns starting to do surveillance of the wastewater for the virus and on there, that this was one of the instruments that's key in enabling that. The federal government has built up over the last year and a half a now ongoing program for wastewater surveillance. That started with SARS-CoV-2, but now is expanding to other viral pathogens that are now creating some new waves of public health issues for our society.
And I could talk about COVID-19 with you for a long time, but we don't want to take up all of your time on COVID. You mentioned tuberculosis. What has your company done in the way of testing for tuberculosis and creating innovations in that area?
Well, that's a really good question. It's also really our flagship diagnostic out there. And interestingly, it's not a nucleic acid analysis diagnostic, but it was a diagnostic we recognized coming out of a startup company in Australia called Celestis. And they were developing this assay to detect tuberculosis in cattle. And we came in and realized this had a larger scale. This was going to be this would be a disruptive technology, acquired and brought Celestis in. And we were able to take the technology and mature it, bring it into the regulated human markets in the United States, Europe, and throughout other regions of the world for regulatory approval for diagnosing, as well as then take the technology and utilize it depending upon different areas of the world. The needs for testing inside the United States are not the same as the needs for testing in Nigeria or in Kenya or Ethiopia, where infectious disease and limited medical supplies really impact the medical economics. We have innovated a system called the QIAGEN that will allow a simpler system and that can work out in a resource limited area that can be used dedicated for public health. It can identify people who would then need to see a doctor for follow-up and further screening. To clarify, maybe people don't realize that things like public health are screening tests that's trying to find the people who before they've had symptoms, where a diagnostic test is something where people already are sick and they're trying to figure out what's making them sick. And those are two very different sorts of paths for getting regulatory approval from bodies like the US FDA. And we have expertise around managing both of those types of pathway approvals.
So we talked about some of the testing that you're doing and that you're responsible for. Because you work with DNA, I have to ask, what is your work in the forensics area? Because given what you do and given what I've heard you talk about today, you must have some sort of impact on the forensics, law enforcement investigations, things like that. Can you tell us about some of that?
I sure can. I'd be happy to, Nick, because that's one of the specialty segments in our life sciences division that's not regulated by bodies like the FDA, but is rather regulated by court and evidence handling standards. And so the quality and reproducibility, reliability of the product is very, very important. Our nucleic acid extraction chemistries are a leading component going into the forensics laboratories, not only for law enforcement forensics, but also for world disasters, when there's mass casualty events, identifying remains, or even in the cases of following up investigations around genocide. We have collaborations with various international forensics organizations that are doing human identification, as well as law enforcement agencies throughout the world where our products are used for both isolation as well as analysis on. We're rather proud of one of our unique partnerships with a company called QIAGEN that is using these latest next generation DNA sequencing to do very careful sequence analysis of human samples to identify by genetics the individuals that they are whose samples we're examining.
And Ray, in the last couple of minutes, you've listed numerous countries. You've talked about international work. You talked about places all around the world, but you're here in Maryland, and your company had decided in 2020 that you wanted to expand in Germantown in Montgomery County. Can you tell us why you chose Montgomery County, why you wanted to expand here?
Yes, I'd be happy to. It's a little before my time, but I was a customer of QIAGEN's going back quite a few years. And there turns out their first US office was in my hometown. I was using their boxes at the time when the address changed. So my hometown name popped out at me. And so I've been very familiar with their use. Their original office when they moved outside of Germany was in the Los Angeles area. When you look at simple time zones for coordination, that's about 9 hours time difference for Germany. Basically, somebody's having to meet outside of their normal office
Right.
space. From the DC area, East Coast US, it's only about 6 hours that we have in that time difference. So my mornings are very busy meeting with my German colleagues. Likewise, my German colleagues' afternoons and early evenings are very busy meeting with their American colleagues. So the East Coast was the first thing that they were looking at to improve our internal communications. But at the same time, this is around 2000, late 1990s. We were dealing with issues of having to expand our manufacturing of the reagents. The single biggest component in our kits for nucleic acid extraction are liquid buffers. They're water-based buffers. They're heavy and they're bulky. And moving all of that over from Europe into the United States was at that time a fairly substantial investment in shipping. And so we decided we needed to build up a manufacturing facility here. We also knew that our reagents were going into clinical laboratory and diagnostic use. And so we were going to need to establish a relationship with the United States FDA. And so we started homing in on the DC area. And really, we started finding and looking at Maryland with the number of life sciences based research institutions between the universities, the NIH, also what was still, even at that time, really growing, but starting a vigorous startup culture for biotechs in this area. And so we chose a site in Germantown, Maryland, to purchase a major property there and begin building out both a manufacturing and an office tower for our America's headquarters that is now based in Germantown. This has evolved over the years. We're looking at expansion plans for there. And quite honestly, when the 2020 pandemic hit, the need for us to expand manufacturing and turn around and invest in that manufacturing expansion really came back to starting off with where are we already established? Do we have these relationships to build? And how quickly can we move out within these areas? And so this is where working within Montgomery County allowed us to build out rather quickly the manufacturing facility that we had. The county was very understanding in the urgency of the pandemic response and helped us get permittings in place and help build this out quickly.
And in Montgomery County, you have access to the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation. Can you talk about how your company has worked alongside that part of the county and how it's helped you to expand and add resources?
Yes. So, when you look over the various resources that the Economic Development Corporation has available for companies, many of them are geared for companies that are starting up. There are more that are available for us. Over the years, based on our strategic timing and use, we haven't utilized very many of the financial programs other than the R&D tax credit to the state of Maryland, which we do use heavily because there is a significant R&D presence in our Germantown facility as well as our Frederick facility in Maryland. What we have done in our involvement here in the area through the Economic Development Corporation is it has provided networking into the property developers we've needed and worked with for some of the leased sites that we've used. Our most recent expansion, in addition at the Germantown site for our headquarters, was also expanding into a leased property a little bit closer to the 270, about 2 miles away from our current site. And so these are all areas where we have built into those. The other reason, the way that we have benefited from our involvement in Montgomery County is also from the startup companies. QIAGEN, for better or for worse, while we started in innovations of our own, have recognized that the growth that we need is not going to come from our own organic growth. We are active in mergers and acquisitions. And the number of startup companies with great technologies here in the Maryland, and specifically in the Montgomery County area, is a great resource for us to network in. As a side note on there to come in, the reason I ended up in QIAGEN was I left an academic position in 2004 to go to a startup company that started in Montgomery County, still was established itself in Frederick. We were 5 years old at the time that I moved in with them. 5 years later, that company was acquired by QIAGEN. It was SA Biosciences. Within that area, we have also acquired in the area a company that was called Quanta Bio, located in the Gaithersburg area. And we also acquired our first major diagnostics company that really paved the foundations for our regulatory to work with tuberculosis. Actually started with human papillomavirus and follow up the pap smears. And that was Diagen that was located in Gaithersburg and acquired them. So it's been a very fruitful a location for us to work and build both. And then beyond the acquisition side, we are a tools company. So there's many of the companies that are innovating and working on innovative assays that are going to build some of those assays on QIAGEN materials. We have not only base kits that go into the labs themselves for use, but we have a very strong business to business channels, whether it be kit configurations for OEM or whether it be raw materials such as enzymes or buffers or materials that need to go in there. So we consider ourselves to be a very business friendly and collaborative organization that we can partner in any way that makes sense, depending upon the size of the company we are partnering with.
And lastly, Ray, I just want to ask you, as we learn about QIAGEN, as you continue to expand in the Montgomery County area, what can we expect from your company in the coming years? What are you most excited about in terms of projects or developments that you have going on?
I'm most excited about the fact that our growth that we're coming out that's not COVID dependent is in part coming from the fact that we launched either shortly before the pandemic or even during the pandemic, in one case, 3 new platforms that utilize our systems. The first one is called the QIAstat-Dx, which is a near patient testing platform. It's about the size of a toaster. And basically it will take a nasal swab that we've used, break off the swab into this cassette, or a nurse can take a blood sample and pipette a blood sample into the pipe, close it up, and it stays closed for the rest of it, put it into the top just like a toaster, and then activate the assay. And in less than an hour, it will return the results for a panel of assays. We had already a FDA approval on a respiratory panel that would test for 24 different viruses, bacteria, and fungal infections of the lungs, and very quickly added both the US CDC and the WHO diagnostic assays for SARS-CoV-2 onto this under an emergency use authorization in the middle of 2020. That's been a great help because it was new. We couldn't put it in all the airports and places that we'd like to for a 1 hour multiple check, but for very severe COVID patients that were going from the emergency room into intensive care, this allowed the doctors in less than an hour to determine, are they just fighting COVID-19, or are they also infected with something else that's aggravating the SARS-CoV-2 infection on them. The other one is a high throughput clinical testing platform called the Pneumatics, that it comes out of a company, that Pneumatics is a company we acquired out of the northern central United States. And this was something we had invested in. This is now building up. And in both the case of QIAstat-Dx and Pneumatics, these are clinical testing platforms. So what we're using is building out these platforms to increase the number of infectious diseases that can be determined from these platforms and improve the utility as we get these out into larger parts of the world and in more labs that are servicing the clinicians and the patients.
Well, it sounds like you have some really exciting stuff, and it's great that you're here in Montgomery County. That's exciting as well. I'd like to thank today's guest, Ray Blanchard, the Associate Director for Global Licensing Corporate Business Development at QIAGEN. I'm your moderator, Nick Iannelli. For more on this discussion, visit WTOP.com and search Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation.